Qantas takes another hit after losing a High Court appeal. The US fast food giant continuing its Aussie business buying spree, and the wealthy property developer who wants unemployment to rise so employees start to feel lucky to have a job again. Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It is Thursday, the 14th of September, 2023. I'm Michael Thompson, and with Sean Aylmer away for a little bit longer, I'm joined instead by Jennifer Duke. Jen, good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
Now, after the show, you have an interview coming up with a fantastic communicator, Justin Tippett, who is the founder and CEO of the Australian Customer Experience Professionals Association. And you can tell the moment you listen to this that Justin knows customer service.
Yeah, he makes you feel so nice when you're talking to him. He's lovely. And we were actually talking all about why customer service seems to be getting so much worse, which I would definitely agree with, unfortunately, how the pandemic kind of affected call centres and why companies shouldn't be overlooking this critical part of their business.
Yeah, it is a really good conversation and some really good messages there about the customer service basics that all businesses really should be looking to implement. It is worth a listen. It's coming up later on. The main story, though, this morning, Jen, Qantas has suffered another serious blow. The airline losing a High Court appeal, with the court upholding a judgment against Qantas that its sacking of almost 1,700 staff back in 2020 was in breach of the Fair Work Act.
Yeah, Qantas previously claimed that it made the decision to get rid of these workers and outsource their roles for an annual cost saving of $103 million and to remove an additional upcoming $80 million expense on ground equipment handling. But because of the timing, staff members were unable to take protected industrial action, which they have a right to do. These legal proceedings were started against Qantas in November 2020, and that was by the Transport Workers Union. They said that the sackings were unlawful. The federal court agreed, as did a full bench of judges, and now the High Court has backed the decision for a third time.
Now, this story really grabbed everybody's attention yesterday. What was the response like outside of court when the judgment was handed down?
So the court was packed with workers who'd lost their jobs, and they were alongside ACTU Secretary Sally McManus and former Transport Workers Union Secretary Senator Tony Sheldon. Mike McNess from the TWU was out front, and he had a message for corporate people of Australia that governance needs an overhaul, and the unions actually want the entire Qantas board to be rolled. Some former workers were out the front of court for a press conference and took quite personal swings at former Qantas CEO Alan Joyce. They were saying that he tried to destroy union workers and didn't have any regard for them or their families. And some were actually choked up about the decision. They said their colleagues had lost their homes, faced relationships breakdowns, and struggled to find other work. It was a hugely emotional time, and it's clear this has taken a toll on a lot of people.
Yeah, and this was really just the latest hit for Qantas. It's had a really, really awful, probably 3 weeks where just one after the other things have gone wrong, and that obviously culminated last week in the early departure of Alan Joyce. How has Qantas responded to yesterday's development?
So Qantas said in a statement that it deeply regrets the personal impact on the staff who are involved. The airline acknowledged and accepted the court's decision. And its statement said that Qantas made the decision mid-COVID when borders were closed and it was facing a multi-year crisis. Compensation for workers and penalties are still being considered, but it could actually be in excess of $200 million.
Okay, now how did local markets perform yesterday?
The S&P ASX 200 closed down 0.7% to 7154 points. In terms of sectors, IT led the falls and tech stocks were down 1.6%. This was led by Nuix, down 12%. Industrials, materials and real estate were also doing pretty poorly. Only two sectors, energy and utilities, were up over the day. There were no real major standouts. Coronado was up 3.1%. The worst performer of the majors was IGO, down 7.6%. It's now trading ex-dividend. And best of the small caps was Star Pharma Holdings, which jumped 23.1%. That followed the announcement of some really positive interim clinical trial results for its new cancer drug.
Yeah, we actually spoke last year to Dr. Jackie Fairley, who is the CEO of Star Pharma, a really interesting company. It's actually worth going back and having a listen to that chat. I think I'll actually put that interview in today's show notes because it was a really good, worthwhile conversation. Now, what's happening in international markets?
So there's a new report from the World Trade Organization that shows China-US trade has kept on growing. But while it hit a record high in 2022, there is a decoupling happening. So the two countries are growing trade with other countries faster than with each other. And this is further confirmation there's a major shift in the global trade dynamic underway right now. Investors are still looking for any hints about China's economy and in particular the troubled real estate market. Now, it's not a lot of official data, so media outlets and economists are relying on private data sets. So take Centerline Group, that's one of the major real estate agencies in Hong Kong and China, and they've looked at the sales of homes recently in Beijing. They found that sales fell more than a third over the past weekend, and that's despite the government loosening mortgage restrictions.
Yeah, that is pretty extraordinary. Now, speaking of extraordinary, what on earth is going on with BP?
Yeah, this one is really interesting. So, British multinational fossil fuel company, BP, has been rocked by revelations that its chief executive, Bernard Looney, failed to fully tell his board the full extent of personal relationships that he had had with colleagues, and he's now had to resign. Investors are wanting BP to refocus on oil and gas while being pushed by environmental campaigners to get to renewables more quickly. So, this is not a great time for them.
No, probably not a good time to be getting caught up in personal relationship dramas. There's a lot going on, Jen. We've got a lot to get through. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Jen, rich lister property developer Tim Gurner, who is the owner of Gurner Group, has lashed out at workers, saying they've been paid a lot to do too little over the past few years and there needs to be a change.
Oh, so this one's going to raise a few eyebrows. So Gurner was speaking at the AFR Property Summit yesterday, and he really didn't hold back his feelings about employees. So he said that people had simply decided during COVID that they didn't really want to work so much anymore and the dynamic needed to change. And how might that dynamic change happen? Well, he thinks it should be a rise in unemployment by as much as 50%. So a few back-of-the-envelope ABS figures suggest that's about 200 to 300,000 people out of work. And I have to quote this in his words for full effect here because he said, this is the quote, "We need to see pain in the economy. We need to remind people that they work for the employer, not the other way around. There's been a systematic change where employees feel the employer is extremely lucky to have them as opposed to the other way around." That's pretty brutal stuff.
Yeah, that is pretty extraordinary, isn't it? And there's a few parts of that you would imagine are going to generate a fairly strong reaction from workers, particularly that line, "We need to remind people that they work for the employer, not the other way around." It could be somewhat inflammatory.
Yeah, we could all feel lucky to have a job and also our employers could be lucky to have us too. Like those two things can exist together.
Yes, it doesn't need to be either or, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Anyway, it's a fascinating story. Now, Jen, the Treasurer's Office has come up with a somewhat unusual yardstick. They are celebrating an achievement of a rare double with Australia's unemployment rate and economic growth in the 3 to 4% bracket for the first time in about half a century.
So Treasurer Jim Chalmers' office put out this new analysis last night, heading off the release of unemployment data later today. And he said the government had been clear and upfront about the toll of high interest rates, high but moderating inflation, and global uncertainty on the nation's economy. But he said he wouldn't be surprised if the unemployment rate ticks up this afternoon, even though we're still in a decent position. And he acknowledged the pressure that households are under right now. But it was a bit of a weird 2 in the 3 mark. I've never really heard of that as an economic measure before.
It does. It does feel a little bit like looking at the data and going, "There's a win in here somewhere."
Somewhere
there it
is.
Now, there's definitely some uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty in the economy. This is something that you would be very, very familiar with in your day job as the economics correspondent for Capital Brief. You've been looking as well at the CommBank Household Spending Insights Index, which was released yesterday and actually increased over August, but it's still way below 2022 levels.
So the index did increase, but when taking inflation into account, there was a decline in spending. The biggest rise in spending over the month and the year was in education, and that's likely due to international students arriving back in Australia, and transport, and that's probably because of high petrol prices. But even with the small nominal lift, the Commonwealth Bank is warning that household spending is going to weaken over the rest of the year and into next year, and that's largely because of those rising interest rates. And maybe there is some nervousness about the jobs market starting to take hold. Now, there was a 70% rise in spending at ticketing agencies, which the bank says is probably due to people jumping in late to get tickets to the FIFA Women's World Cup in August. But in general, people are spending a lot more money on essentials right now rather than all the things that they'd probably like to spend on.
I love the data and the detail that you can see within this. The fact that they can actually see the 70% increase in spending at ticketing agencies, and then you look at the calendar and go, okay, well that does make sense because that was when the FIFA Women's World Cup was on, so therefore this equals that. The access that the Commonwealth Bank has to this kind of data is quite extraordinary.
It's terrific. And it's interesting because you sort of think that often people say you get these big economic effects from something like FIFA Women's World Cup. Well, actually, you can measure it now, which is sort of nice.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Now, there's potentially a new multi-billion-dollar local industry in the making in the form of decommissioning aging oil and gas infrastructure. And Resources Minister Madeleine King is considering tighter laws to force oil and gas giants to pay for the cleanup and the opportunities to capitalise.
So there's a new issues paper that's just been released, and it's calling for industry and public feedback on the different ways and techniques to manage this task, but also to grow Australian expertise. King told Parliament yesterday that the decommissioning work could be worth $60 billion over 30 to 50 years, and getting it right up front could also be the blueprint for managing ageing renewable energy infrastructure down the track. She thinks a decommissioning industry would have huge economic opportunities, be a job creator, and potentially become a new export of expertise to other countries.
Now, Jen, I know that Tim Gurner's comments before are probably going to be fairly divisive. Not as much as this next story. Potato cakes, potato fritters, potato scallops. I don't know what you want to call them. And it depends on kind of where you are and who you're talking to at the time, that sometimes you need to actually adjust what you call them in order to fit in. But whatever you call it, the US wants them. A Melbourne manufacturer, Cracker Jack Foods, has been gobbled up by the US fast food giant Lamb Weston for an unspecified price.
So firstly, put your chips on the table. What do you call them?
Put your chips on the... Well done. I mean, I'm assuming you're referring to potato chips, but potato scallops. As far as I'm concerned, there is no alternative.
Wow, that is divisive.
What do you call them?
I'm in potato fritter category.
I suspect you are in the extreme minority on this one, but please go on.
Probably right. We'll get some hate mail. So Cracker Jack's annual revenue is about $20 million, and it's actually a major supplier for fish and chip shops in Australia, as well as clubs, pubs, cafes, and even briefly McDonald's. And the Financial Review reports that this US buyer wants to double down on production with the company. So at the moment, the business has 2 Melbourne plants, which Lamb Weston is acquiring as part of this deal. And it's possible that they might look to snap up more Australian businesses in future too. So Lamb Weston actually bought up 2 other local businesses, Marvel Packers and Ready Meals, in the past few years.
Now, Jen, average Australians concerned about housing affordability might get a new forum to speak to the federal government. Independent Allegra Spender has been drumming up crossbench support to create a citizens' assembly on housing so that everyone gets a say.
So this would be a new body that's set up to provide advice and feedback to the government on housing, and it would be made up of everyday people. The AFR spoke to Spender, who said it would bring together Australians from across all generations and they would get philanthropic funding for the project. Now, I don't know if anyone remembers, but Julia Gillard actually proposed a citizens' assembly in 2010 on climate change, and it ended up being replaced with an expert panel. So it's not clear whether Spender's idea has had cut through with the crossbench yet, but we know the Greens are positioning themselves as the party of renters and are very focused on this issue right now, so it might happen.
The mortgage wars aren't yet over, Jen, according to Commonwealth Bank Executive General Manager for Home Buying, Michael Bowman.
So Bowman told Bloomberg that competition is still fearsome and is at levels he hasn't previously seen, and he thinks it's going to continue into 2024. Now, the Commonwealth Bank is the nation's biggest lender, holding about a quarter of Australia's residential mortgages, but it's currently facing a decline in its portfolio, and that's after intense competition between the banks for market share. That includes thousands of dollars in cashback offers and other sweeteners to lure in refinances. At the moment, there's a major shift of home borrowers off of low fixed rate loans who face much higher interest rates due to Reserve Bank increases, and this is a pressure point for banks trying to hold on to mortgage customers.
And there's a bit more trouble brewing for the bank as well, Jen. The federal court is being urged to slap Commonwealth Bank with the biggest possible penalty over its $16 million worth of underpayments to staff.
It's been a busy day in the court. So the Fair Work Ombudsman wants the maximum penalty imposed so that it's an example to other businesses. The CBA case is actually one of the biggest underpayment ones so far, with the bank admitting in early 2023 that it underpaid 7,400 staff members knowingly over the course of 10 years. And the fine for serious contraventions can be up to $630,000 per breach for cases since 2017. The highest fine would still be less than the underpayment actually totaled. That's according to the Ombudsman's barrister, who says it needs to be at a maximum to be an economic deterrent and a sufficient sting to big business. CBA's barrister, though, says that the bank knowingly underpaid in terms of the legal definition, but it was actually a result of carelessness and there was no deliberate contravention. CBA actually self-reported the breach and has paid staff back.
Now, this is an interesting survey, Jen. Aussies apparently want to raid their superannuation right now to fund expenses, home buying, and spring breaks. That's according to this survey from comparison website Finder.
So, according to their research, more than half of those that they surveyed would dip into their super right now if they had the opportunity, as in this instant. And the most common reason was, pretty unsurprisingly, to tackle the cost of living crisis and take pressure off their household budgets. And a further 15% said they'd use it to buy a home, another 8% for an investment property, 4% said they wanted to use it to buy property for their child. But most worryingly, 8% wanted to blow their retirement funds on a holiday, which might explain why the government is so stringent about who can and can't tap into their super. Also of concern was that almost 60% of survey respondents said that they didn't know how much they have in their super right now.
Yeah, that's a little bit alarming. Jen, now turning to international news, Kim Jong-un is in Russia at the moment, meeting with President Vladimir Putin. The US says the two leaders are discussing weapons supply for the war in Ukraine. This is just really worrying news.
It is a little bit alarming, to put it mildly. So the media has been tracking the North Korean leader's armoured train over the last few days, and the state-run media in both countries has confirmed that they are meeting, but they haven't shared details, and there is no official itinerary here. So a lot of this is speculation that the two countries are discussing weapons for Moscow in exchange for economic help for North Korea. This is the first time the North Korean leader has left the peninsula since 2019, and the meeting is sparking tensions given their nuclear arsenals. Putin's also expected to be in discussions with Chinese President Xi Jinping later this year.
Now, in the US, you have Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy officially calling for a formal impeachment inquiry into President Joe Biden. This is after investigations from the House Oversight Committee, which is Republican-controlled.
So this inquiry is about alleged corruption relating to his family's business dealings. McCarthy says there are credible allegations from during the president's term as vice president from 2009 to 2017. And McCarthy told the media that they found Biden had lied to the American people about his knowledge of his family's business dealings, with witnesses alleging that he made calls and used his influence to benefit his son and his son's associates to the tune of millions of dollars. The White House says that this is all without basis.
And in slightly lighter news, Jen, Apple has unveiled its new iPhones, which I always get tremendously excited about. I love seeing these announcements. There are 4 new models. There's the 15, and the 15 Plus, and the 15 Pro, and the 15 Pro Max. And there's new Apple Watches as well that are being made with eco-friendly materials. They're being described as a significant overhaul for the tech, though shares did slip slightly when they were released. But, Jen, will they be enough to overcome a potential slump in China?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question at the moment. And this iPhone actually makes up half of Apple's revenue. So any new release is a massive event and can make or break the success of the business. Now, we're also a couple of weeks out from the next operating system. And as we've been discussing, China's increasingly banning the use of iPhones for government and state-owned business workers. And there's this ongoing tech tussle between the US and China. Pre-orders are being taken by Apple for the new phones on Friday in 40 countries. That includes the US, India, Canada, and China.
Apple CEO Tim Cook said the Pro models are, quote, the very best of Apple innovations, which you've got to say, that's a pretty big call.
Yes, it is. I mean, they are kind of impressive. So they can actually record video in 3D and then you can use that on their Vision Pro headset. So I think that's really amazing. But most of the coverage so far has been focused on the switch from that controversial Lightning port charge connection to the more commonly used USB-C.
I did have to laugh during the presentation of all the new technology. Appeared up on the screen behind, in the middle of the giant amphitheatre. There was a quote on there from someone who has appeared on Fear and Greed before, Stephen Fennick, who is from techguide.com.au, and he's talked to us about various kind of tech companies before. He's talked about Apple, he's talked about Amazon, and he was quite chuffed to see that a quote from him praising the Vision Pro headsets appeared on the big screen behind this Apple CEO during the big Apple announcement. He was less chuffed when he saw that his name, which is Stephen Fennick, was written as Stephen French up there on the big screen. So his big moment was a little bit tarnished, unfortunately, but still pretty special. He
has to change his name.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're being seen by tens of millions of people, you probably just go with what everybody is seeing. You just go, yep, you know what?
That's right.
I'm Stephen French from now on. Finally, Jen, we need to move on. We've got to wrap things up. Google has been forced to defend billions of dollars of payments to device giants like Apple and to browser companies as well over accusations from the US Justice Department that it uses cash dash to keep its market share in search at 90%.
So Google's actually facing a major lawsuit from the department at the moment, which claims it is illegally maintaining a monopoly and is crossing antitrust lines by striking deals with smartphone makers. And the search giant's lawyer says the payments are actually to compensate other companies who have to do a lot of work to make sure that their software is updated quickly. Google's been arguing that consumers can just very easily use rivals like Bing, Yahoo, or DuckDuckGo. I don't know when the last time you used DuckDuckGo was.
I don't think I've ever even heard of DuckDuckGo. I just love the way you said it with such confidence as though I would know what it was. I'm still stuck in the kind of, do you remember Alta Vista? And those other kind of, no. Anyway, you know what? Okay, let's just move on. Up next is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. You are speaking today to Justin Tippett, the founder and CEO of the Australian Customer Experience Professionals Association.
Yeah, Justin goes into really great detail about the various ways that businesses can provide customer service, and he talks about some examples of companies getting it wrong, including his own worst experience. It's a really fun chat.
Yeah, it's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. And there's never been a better time to listen to the new episode of How Do They Afford That, our sister podcast, which just by sheer coincidence, though we should say that we planned it, this week is all about how to afford your new phone, whether to buy it outright or whether to get it on a plan or anything. We look at it all from a managing your money point of view. You'll find that one wherever you listen to podcasts as well. And I'll put a link in today's show notes. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks so much, Michael.
It is Thursday, the 14th of September, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed Business News. Have a great day.